Pleasure to introduce Associate Professor of History, Mary Cain from Agnes Scott College. Professor Cain is a distinguished scholar whose work brings a fresh perspective and depth to early American history in terms of race and gender. You have focus on race and gender, correct? Fantastic. My research is good so far. She earned her BA from Yale University, followed by a master's degree and a Ph.D. from Emory, building strong academic foundation that informs her classroom teaching classes like early U.S. history, American women's history, African American history, the history of slavery, and Native American history. Good, I did some research and got them all right. Check for me tonight. Tonight she will guide us through an engaging exploration of the American Revolution with a particular focus on the often overlooked roles and experiences of women during this transformative period. Her research and teaching illuminate how women not only witnessed history, but actively shaped it in meaningful ways. Please welcome Dr. Mary Cain.
And thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful to the Milton branch for this opportunity. 2026, the 200th anniversary year, is obviously a big year for the United States. It's a big year for U.S. history. It's a big year for U.S. historians. And I'm delighted to be able to be here to reflect on the American Revolution and its profound significance. I'm a woman and an historian. I am a women's historian, and I teach women's history at a historically women's college, which is another way of saying that I have one of the best jobs in the world. And when I talk to an audience, whether it is a group of students or whether it's an event such as this, I like to see my job as really complicating and thereby enriching our understanding of the past. Often people think of history as kind of this thing happened, and then another thing happened, and then another thing happened, and then we got to where we are today. But obviously there's a whole lot more to it than that. We're still learning about all the things that have happened and how those events have resonated differently to different people at different times. Mm-hmm. The first and most basic thing that I want any student or any audience to know when I speak is that there is no single, common, collective, consensual narrative of American history. It's something we talk about a lot in the field of women's history. In our field, it's not like we take a main narrative of the American past and then just ask, well, so what were women doing while this was going on? We don't take the approach that one historian I know calls derisively a, quote, add gender and mix kind of approach. Instead, what we do is we look to craft narratives and find turning points in history that have been essential to shaping the experiences of women as women. To illustrate what I mean, I invite you to think about what might be kind of a standard timeline of United States history. And if you think about some of the important events that you would put on such a timeline, you might think about events like, well, World War II would be a biggie, right? In terms of the lives lost, in terms of democracy saved, in terms of ushering in the atomic era and ushering in the Cold War, the creation of the United Nations, the creation of NATO, right? I think we can agree that World War II would belong on most people's timelines. Obviously, the Civil War and Emancipation, another absolute key turning point in the history of the United States. You might put 9/11 on this timeline. Another turning point when everybody who was alive at that time felt like their lives had changed. Some people might put the Great Depression on there. Again, another biggie. More recently, we might add the COVID-19 pandemic when we all felt our lives change in such profound ways. And more apropos to the conversation we're having tonight, I think we would all put the American Revolution and the drafting of the Constitution on the timeline of big events in American history. There would obviously be a lot more events. My slide was only so big. And obviously, American women experienced all of these things alongside American men. But that doesn't necessarily make this a women's history timeline, right? This is a timeline of American history. When we do women's history, we want to think instead about a timeline where we're thinking about events that really matter to women and change their lives as women, and that timeline might look a little different. So one of the obvious ones that people might put on such a timeline is the 19th Amendment, which gave American women the right to vote, told them that their voices mattered, right? Their political identities mattered. We also know that when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, Jim Crow laws meant that it did not apply to all women. And it's not until later, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that Black women have that political voice, that political power. Other events we might put on such a timeline, the Industrial Revolution, for one, which fundamentally changed women's lives in terms of the household labor they performed, in terms of gender roles, in terms of gender norms, in terms of redefinitions of family relationships, renegotiating the relationship between public and private. And if the historian Linda Gordon were here, she would add something else to this timeline. She would say that this is the single biggest game changer in American women's history. It was when women had access to reliable birth control. The big question for tonight is, did the American Revolution and the drafting of the Constitution go on this timeline? Were these critical turning points in the history of American women as women? Another way of asking the question is the title of the talk: was the American Revolution a watershed for women? I should say that before we go any further in this talk, I don't plan to give you an absolute and authoritative answer to that question. Instead, what I'd like to do is set up a framework and chart out some intellectual space in which each person here can wrestle with that question and with its implications. So to do that tonight, I'd like to talk about three themes. First, I want to establish that American women, at least patriot women, were heavily invested in the American Revolution. We do know that many women who lived in the colonies were loyalists. They remained loyal to Great Britain, remained loyal to the king, and did not support the revolution. We're not talking about them tonight. We also know that there were many Native American women who inhabited this continent. And for the most part, they tried to stay away from the American Revolution and its implications. So they're not also going to be the focus here. Instead, we're looking at those women who did support the revolutionary project. Incidentally, when the war broke out, that was probably about a third of the women who lived in the British colonies. As the war went on, more and more women started to identify as patriot women. So that's the first category tonight. The second thing I'd like to talk about, and this will probably be the largest part of the talk, is to look at women's various contributions, how they pitched in on the battlefields, on the home front, in the economy to make sure this revolutionary war was a success. And then the third thing I'd like to talk about is to reflect on the outcomes, to try to figure out, once the war was over, once the new country was created, once the Constitution was written, figure out if anything changed for women as women. To set the stage, let's look at these words, probably the most famous words to ever come from an American pen or an American quill. And we'll read the beginning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's from the beginning, of course, the Declaration of Independence, what we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of this year. It's a long document, and as you go down further into the document, there's more. The document continues to make many points justifying separation from Great Britain, including the one that I have at the bottom of the screen, which is really the heart of the matter. Asserting the obligations of an oppressed people to throw off tyranny, the Declaration continues, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Right? So that was the rationale, the justification for declaring independence, for making a new nation, for going to war against Great Britain. For my purposes, this is of course the word I'm most interested in, right? The word men, which is clearly enshrined in that opening sentence, it seems to imply males only were included in this revolution. But that's not necessarily the way patriot women interpreted at the time. To illustrate this, Exhibit A is really Abigail Adams, and I know this series has had a talk about the relationship between John and Abigail Adams, so these words are likely familiar to you as well. In her famous correspondence with her husband John, Abigail wrote, "I long to hear that you've declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." Abigail Adams is well aware of political events. She's writing to her husband John when he's away in Philadelphia because he is on the committee that is writing the Declaration of Independence. She knows that a declaration is forthcoming, and she implores the political class to remember the ladies and extend voting rights to women in their new code of laws. Then she continues, and she goes on to apply the logic of revolutionary argument to the position of women. She writes, "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Here she's clearly echoing the ideas we just saw on the last slides from the Declaration of Independence. She says, if particular care and attention, that's her spelling by the way, particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, they will foment a rebellion. The same logic that the revolutionaries were using against Britain was being used here by American women against American men to fight for equality. And part of what I find so impressive about this document is that Abigail Adams wrote this in late March of 1776, more than 3 months before the Declaration of Independence was signed or distributed. And yet, she's plugged in enough, she's enough on top of her Republican theory that she can use the arguments central to the Declaration of Independence even before there was a Declaration of Independence. Another woman who took the liberatory ideas of the Revolution seriously was Elizabeth Freeman. At the outbreak of the war, Elizabeth Freeman was enslaved in western Massachusetts, where she went by the name of Bet. Her enslavers were John and Hannah Ashley, both patriots, and John Ashley liked to host political gatherings at their home. In 1780, Massachusetts wrote a new state constitution, and John Ashley invited several white men over to the house so they could read and celebrate the content of that document. Article 1 of the Massachusetts Constitution, which John Ashley read out loud that evening, said, quote, "All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights." Elizabeth Freeman was in the room when that document was read. She was there serving the white men, reading and celebrating this idea of independence, and she was enslaved. The next day, having heard these words, she slipped away, and she met up with a young attorney in her town, an attorney named Theodore Sedgwick, who had a reputation for ties to anti-slavery. She said to him, quote, "I heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are created equal and that every man has a right to freedom. I'm not a dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom?" And Sedgwick decides to take her case and decides to sue the state of Massachusetts under the new Constitution, saying that the ideas embedded in the Constitution were incompatible with the institution of slavery. He combines her case with the case of a man who's also enslaved by the Ashleys, a man named Brom. And the lawsuit, Brom and Bet v. Ashley, is heard by the Massachusetts State Supreme Court in 1781. The court rules that slavery is not compatible with the new state constitution, that Bet and Brom are free people, and in fact, all enslaved people in Massachusetts will forward be free. this is the beginning of kind of a ripple effect. After this case, every state in the northern part of the new United States looks at its own constitution, looks at its own consciences, and tries to decide what its future with slaveholding will be. And every single state north of Maryland, in the period after the American Revolution, takes steps to end slavery in their state. They don't all do it the same way, they don't all do it immediately, but every single state takes steps to end slavery in the North. And it all starts with Elizabeth Freeman hearing these words and going to see her lawyer and taking this case to court. American patriot women, like Elizabeth Freeman, were well aware of what was on the line. They knew that the stakes of the revolution could entail liberation, and they dedicated themselves to the cause. They felt like its outcome mattered to them, to their families, to their futures, to their fortunes. They saw themselves as active participants in the struggle, and they expected to be active participants in the new political and social structure that would emerge after the American victory over the British. To that end, they made vast and dear sacrifices for the cause, contributing to the war effort, holding together the home front, sustaining boycotts of British goods, and picking up the slack in production once they determined to no longer purchase anything made in Britain. There are also stories of women who left loyalist families if those families didn't support the patriot cause, and stories of women who refused to date men whom they decided were insufficiently patriotic. They were personally and politically invested. Some women were also financially invested. One of them is Rachel Wells. She was a widow. She did not come from a very affluent background, not a very well-educated background, not a very well-connected background, but she did pretty well for herself. She was a wax sculptor, and she would sell these figurines that she made out of wax, and she was able to amass quite a small fortune before the war broke out. At the beginning of the war, she decided to lend her nest egg to the cause of the American Revolution, and she advanced to the new US government the sum of 300 pounds in gold, which was quite a lot of money in that time. We know about this because after the war, she asked for it back. And she didn't get an answer. And she tried to get her money back and didn't get much response. Finally, she wrote a letter to her representatives in which she said to them, quote, "I have done as much to carry on the war as many that sit now at the helm of government." Right? And so she's taking credit for having helped win this war by having donated her money. Unfortunately, we don't have a record of what happened after she sent this letter. There's not evidence that she ever was paid back. There's not evidence she wasn't paid back, but I can't tell you quite the outcome of that story. And by the way, 300 pounds in gold in 1776, today would be the equivalent of probably close to $100,000. So we're not talking about a small amount of money. So women were invested in the war and in its outcome. Okay, what I'd like to do now is drill down a little bit and talk about some of the crucial roles played by patriot women. For tonight, I've identified 5 key ways in which women contributed to the war cause. They served as soldiers and spies. They served as camp followers. They served as what one historian has called deputy husbands, kind of looking after things on the home front. They served as producers, and they served as the main force that sustained the American boycotts. These categories, I'm presenting them here as 5 separate categories, but there was actually a fair bit of overlap between them, and a lot of women played more than one role at a time. But in general, we can think of some of this as being work that they did actually in the field with the soldiers supporting the war, and then some of this work they were doing on the home front. So let's start with women in the field, women who worked as soldiers, spies, and camp followers. I have just a couple illustrations here. The larger picture on the left is a picture of Deborah Sampson. She is a woman who fought in the war. We do have stories of women who served as soldiers fighting for the American cause. and she's the best known of them. Women could not fight as women in the 1770s and 1780s. But we have many stories of women who dressed as men and took on male names and volunteered to fight. Deborah Sampson was a fairly poor woman who didn't have a lot of prospects when the war broke out. And she decided that the ideas of this revolution mattered deeply to her, and she wanted to do what she could. She didn't have 300 pounds in gold to donate, but she had her body, which she was willing to put on the line. So she cut her hair, she borrowed a suit of men's clothes, and she went and she enlisted in the Continental Army under the name Robert Shurtleff. And she served most of the war, fighting alongside men who never knew her real identity until late in the war. She got very sick, some abdominal illness, maybe something like appendicitis. Not clear what she had, but she was in so much pain that she had to see the medic who gave her a physical exam and realized that this person they'd known by the name Robert Shurtleff was in fact not Robert at all, but was indeed Deborah Sampson. She wasn't able to return to the front in part because she was so ill, and in part because they realized that she was a woman. But when the war was over, she met a man, married him, settled down, lived to a somewhat old age, but she died before her husband did. And when she died, her husband wrote to the US Congress and identified himself as the spouse of a Revolutionary War veteran and thought he was entitled to a widow's bonus. And he became the first American widower to be a Revolutionary War, to receive a bonus. Here, at the top right, is an image of one of my favorite women from this time period, a woman named Lydia Darrah. She was a Quaker. She lived in Philadelphia. And early in the war, Philadelphia became an occupied city, and the British came in, took it over. Across the street from where she lived with her husband and her children was a nice house that the British moved into, and they took it over and made it their local headquarters, and she saw them coming and going from that house. One day the officers showed up at her house, probably because the Darrows were Quakers. They thought they were pacifists and would not have a side in the war. But the British soldiers came in and said, "We need your dining room. We're having a secret important meeting tonight, and we're gonna use your dining room." And she was not in a position to say no. Officers come in, and they tell her, "Go away, go upstairs, don't listen, don't eavesdrop, this has nothing to do with you. You can come down in the morning and we'll be gone." So she and her family go upstairs, but she doesn't stay upstairs. She goes back down, puts her ear to the door, where she hears these British officers planning a sneak attack on the Continental Army at White Marsh. She scurries back upstairs before the meeting is done, unbeknownst to the soldiers and unbeknownst to her husband, who doesn't know that she sneaked out to do this eavesdropping. And she lies awake all night trying to figure out, how am I going to warn Washington's men? How can I do this? By morning, she has a plan. Philadelphia is an occupied city. She couldn't just kind of go off and go out and find the American soldiers. She needs a way, a pretext for navigating the city so that she can get to the outskirts, so she can get herself to a position where she can meet the Continentals. So what she does in the morning, she goes into her kitchen and she grabs a sack of flour and she dumps the flour out on the counter because she doesn't need the flour. She needs the sack. She takes her empty sack and she goes out into the street, and every time she meets a British soldier who says, "Where are you going? Why are you out and about?" she holds up her empty sack and she says, "I'm out of flour. I have to go to the mill, I have to get more flour." And every time she does that, they say, "Okay, go ahead, this is women's work, just go get your flour, don't make any trouble." And she's able to maneuver all the way through the city with her empty flour sack till she gets to the outskirts where there's a mill, and there's also a way to get to Washington soldiers, and she tips them off to expect a surprise attack at White Marsh. And when the British do attack at White Marsh, they're the ones who are surprised because Washington's army is waiting for them and becomes an American victory. The other image I have here represents a camp follower. Camp followers were what they sound like. Women who followed the camp around, followed the soldiers around. They didn't have any official capacity. They were usually poor women, women who didn't have any place else to go or any place else to be during the war. And usually they were related to one of the soldiers in the camp. So maybe it was their husband, maybe it was their brother, maybe it was their son. And they didn't have any other place to reside. And so they would follow the soldiers and they would do some really important work. They would cook for them. They would do their laundry. They would help with morale. They would nurse sick and wounded soldiers. And they very much became part of the war experience, doing some critical work. One example is Margaret Corbin. She married a man named John Corbin shortly before the war in 1772. And when he enlisted in the army, she followed him. And she lived in the camp of the 1st Company of the Pennsylvania Artillery. John was killed in battle at the Battle of Fort Washington in late 1776. At that point, Margaret stepped in and took up his weapon, and she served in the company doing his work until she suffered an incapacitating wound. After the war, the state of Pennsylvania and the U.S. Congress also awarded her disability payments. The picture you see is meant to be an illustration of probably the most famous camp follower, who was known as Molly Pitcher. The Molly Pitcher story is that she was a camp follower who would bring water to the soldiers during the Battle of Monmouth. And as she was carrying the water out in a pitcher, that's why they called her Molly Pitcher, as she was carrying the water out to the artillery section, an artilleryman was felled. She jumped in at that point to pick up his work and use the ramrod to help man the cannon. It's possible that Molly Pitcher was the nickname of a real woman named Mary Hayes, but it's more likely that Molly Pitcher is kind of an amalgam of many stories of many camp followers who stepped up and served in battlefield capacity when needed. Molly Pitcher and Margaret Corbin are the most famous camp followers, probably because they're associated with battlefield heroics and with filling in manly roles. But the most significant contribution camp followers made were, in fact, in the 19th century version of womanly roles. The Continental Army was pretty ragtag, with not much in the way of services or supports. Women volunteered to provide that service and that support, to keep the soldiers fed, clean, healthy. Let's be clear, the work they did, cooking, sewing, laundry, nursing, this was all unpaid, and it was not always appreciated. George Washington was really unhappy about the presence of camp followers in camp. He thought they were a distraction, he thought they were a liability. That said, he did come to understand their value and the important role that they played, especially in terms of morale. And before long, he sent to Mount Vernon to ask his wife Martha to join him in camp. Martha was not at the Battle of Yorktown, but a 41-year-old camp follower named Sarah Osborne was. She was delivering food to men under artillery fire. General Washington stopped her and asked her, "Are you not afraid of the cannonballs?" "No," she replied. "It would not do for the men to fight and starve too." Most patriot women did not ever see a battlefield, but they contributed heartily to the war effort from their roles on the home front. So let's turn our attention there. The first home front role I want to talk about is that of the so-called deputy husband. This is a term that was coined by the historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. She uses the term to indicate that women during this war had to step into traditionally male household roles when the men were off fighting or serving in the new state and continental governments. So on the screen now, I've got examples of two deputy husbands. On the left, the kind of formidable looking woman is Mary Fish Silliman. Mary Silliman was from a prominent family in Connecticut, and she married into another prominent family in Connecticut. Her husband Selleck was a state's attorney, and part of his job as a state's attorney, kind of like a district attorney or prosecutor, is he prosecuted loyalists or Tories for being traitors to the revolution. This meant that he developed many political enemies. And one night, a group of armed men burst into the Silliman house. They terrorized the family, and they kidnapped Selig Silliman. They transported him to British-occupied New York, where they put him in prison. While he's in prison, all of the work of running the large farm falls to Mary. She has to oversee the planting, the harvesting, she has to keep the accounts, she has to negotiate the sale of crops, she has to manage the farm labor, which for the Sillimans involved a few hired hands from the town and a few enslaved people. And she didn't just manage the labor. Because labor was scarce during the war, she had to be a laborer herself, and she was out in the fields working alongside the others. By the way, she was also 6 months pregnant the night that her husband was kidnapped. And she gave birth to her second son, Benjamin, while her husband was away. Among the many jobs that Mary Silliman took on as a deputy husband was strategizing on how to get her other husband back. Over the course of about 11 months, she wrote dozens of letters to civic and military leaders. She met with some of Washington's high command. She met with the governor and the Council of Connecticut to urge them to negotiate Selig's release. Political and military officials refused to consider offering a ransom because they did not want to encourage the British to keep kidnapping U.S. citizens. So Mary Silliman figured out that the best prospect for getting her husband back would be to arrange some kind of prisoner exchange. But when she approached the state of Connecticut, they told her that they did not have any prisoners for exchange. And the Continental Army told her that they only had prisoners of war who had been captured on the battlefield. Selig had been kidnapped from his home as a private citizen, not as a soldier. And the Army told Mary that a private citizen could only be swapped for another private citizen, of which they had none. So what did she do? She decided to kidnap her own private citizen. Someone she could trade to get her husband back. She selected a target. He was a judge, Judge Thomas Jones, who lived on Long Island. He was high up in the Loyalist community. And she hired a team of about 20 men to cross the Long Island Sound under cover of darkness and seize Judge Jones. They snatched the judge, they brought him back to the Silliman house, where Mary kept him and had to take care of him. The whole plan was risky and not without its losses. One of the men Mary hired died when he was shot during the raid on Judge Jones' house. But the plan did work. After 51 weeks in captivity, Selig was released and returned the same day that Mary's allies released Judge Jones. On the right side of the screen is another deputy husband, Lucy Flucker Knox. Her story is quite different from Mary Silliman's in the details, but similar in the sense that she had to navigate the war experience and take care of all family and domestic matters on her own while her husband served. Lucy came from a prominent Loyalist family, but she, with her independent thinking, supported the revolutionary cause. In 1774, she married an ambitious American militia officer named Henry Knox. And from that point forward, her parents disowned her. They supported Britain and were so horrified by the revolution and by their daughter's actions that they moved back to England. She never spoke with them again. You may have heard of the husband, Henry Knox. He rose to be one of Washington's most trusted generals. He became Secretary of War during the war, and then after the Constitution was written, he became the first Secretary of War of the new United States. Because he was in service, the Knoxes were apart for much of the war, and she didn't really have any place to live. Henry thought that because of his position, it would be unsafe for her to live alone, as she could be a target for Tories. She couldn't live with her parents, they were gone, so she shifted from friend to friend. Sometimes she stayed in taverns, sometimes she joined Henry in camp. Once she stayed at Mount Vernon with Martha Washington. Lucy wrote many letters to Henry, and I thought I'd share part of one with you. This is from August of 1777, and her husband is in the fight. She writes, "I wrote you a line by the last post just to let you know I was alive, which was all I could then say with propriety. I'm now to answer your 3 last letters, in one of which you ask for the history of my life. How such it is, I give to you. In the first place, I rise about 8 in the morning, so late an hour you will say, but the day after that is full long for a person in my condition." She was pregnant at this time. "I presently after sit down to my breakfast, where a page in my book and a dish of tea employ me alternately for about an hour. When after seeing that family matters go on right, I repair to my work for the rest of the noon. At 2 o'clock I usually take my solitary dinner, where I reflect upon my past happiness. I often spend the evening entirely alone, to reflect that the only friend I have in the world is in such an immense distance from me, to think that he may be sick and I cannot assist him. My poor heart is ready to burst. When I seriously reflect that I've lost my mother, father, brother, and sisters, entirely lost, then I am half distracted. 'Tis hard, my Harry, indeed it is. I love you with the tenderest and purest affection." So then she turns to finances, and she mentions, "The very little gold we have must be reserved for my love, in case he should be taken for ransom." She did not, I guess, get the Silliman memo that they were not paying ransoms, but she's saving her money just in case. She continues by imagining what their lifestyle is going to be like after the war, and this is my favorite part. She says, "Persons who have ever lived in affluence are in danger of want, and that you had less of the military man about you, you might then, after the war, have lived at ease all the days of your life. But now I don't know what you will do, you being long accustomed to command. I hope you will not consider yourself as commander-in-chief of your own house, but be convinced that there is such thing as equal command." I chose this letter, and I chose Lucy Knox because I love that last line. Right? I think it's so compelling. Do not be a commander-in-chief in your own home. And saying that she expects equal command reads very much to me like the words of a woman who has sacrificed so much for the war, for independence, and she's determined to have some independence herself when it's all over. Something else Lucy Knox makes reference to in this letter is she talks about having repaired to my work as part of what she does as a deputy husband for part of the day. And I think we should talk about this work. Keep in mind that Lucy Knox is not living in her own household, and keep in mind that she's fairly affluent. Even still, like all patriot women, she spent part of the day doing labor. Of course, women have always, throughout history, engaged in domestic labor and have long had responsibilities caring for the home, caring for the children, doing other things. But during the Revolutionary period, patriot women took on additional responsibilities as household producers in ways they hadn't before. This is because earlier in the colonial period, they'd imported so many of their goods from England, and now they don't want to do that anymore. Buying English goods was supporting the enemy, and patriot women weren't going to do that. But they still needed to provision their households, right? And so it becomes their work to figure out how to do it. So, for example, they're not drinking British tea anymore, but they need to drink something. So they spend their time going out into the fields to collect berries, to collect herbs, to collect currants, so they could make their own tea at home. They're not going to import sugar anymore through the English companies. How do they get something sweet? Well, they collect honey from beehives. In the north, they go out and they tap the maple trees and get syrup. Some of them plant beets and extract beetroot sugar from the beets they have planted. It becomes additional work for them. They can't just go to the store to buy these products. They have to do extra work to find them. The main British product that patriot women had to replace with their labor and it was very labor intensive. The product was cloth. England had started to industrialize before the Revolution, and Americans had gotten used to purchasing relatively cheap manufactured textiles from these English traders. But wartime boycotts of British goods meant that they now had to produce their own cloth, and women and girls started spending a large portion of every day in textile work. They would gather in spinning bees, and in many cases, they had to even remind each other how it all worked. Right? How do you spin? How do you weave? These are skills that they didn't have so much anymore because they'd gotten so used to purchasing manufactured textiles. If you've ever been involved in any of the fiber arts, you know that it is very labor intensive. The patriot women worked with a few different kinds of textiles. They don't have very much cotton yet, but they do have some silk in places where there were silkworms. They do have some wool in places where they had sheep. But the most popular and the most important textile was linen. You grow linen from flax. So when women wanted to produce homespun from homespun linen, they started with seeds and they planted the flax. And they had to grow the flax and tend the flax and harvest the flax. And flax grows kind of grass, tall and thin. It's got a tough exterior shell, and inside there are these silky fibers. And it's the silky fibers that they wanted, right? So once they harvested the flax, they had to go through a process that they called breaking the flax. They had to break that rough, husky exterior off the plant so they could get these few little silky fibers inside. And to do that, they would use this apparatus, which kind of looks like a bed of nails. And they would take a bundle of the flax, long flax, and they would throw it over the bed of nails and pull on it, and throw it over and pull on it, and the nails would start to strip away the husky exterior, and then they'd pick out the little fibers, the threads inside. Once they did that, they had to spin those fibers into thread. Once they did that, they had to weave those threads into cloth. Once they did that, they had to dye it, and then they could cut it, and then they could sew it, and they could embroider it. But it was a very, very labor-intensive process. Back early in my studies, I spent a summer working at a living history museum. And it was a museum dedicated to 18th century, late 18th century crafts. And the woman I worked with dressed in period costume. She had the apron and the skirt and the blouse and the mob cap. And she told me that like one of her personal projects she had going on is she was trying to make herself an outfit of 18th century clothing that she could wear to work and make it herself using the methods that women had done at the time. And so she planted the flax, right? And she grew the flax, and she harvested the flax, and she broke the flax, and she was going through all these steps. And the point I knew her, she was just about done spinning, and she was getting ready to start weaving. And I said, wow, that sounds like it's taking a long time. And she said, yeah, it's been 4 years now. Oh my God. I said, wow, 4 years. I said, it makes you wonder how these women could do it back then. And she said, yeah, but you have to remember, I work full time, which was true. What I didn't tell her, but I've thought about a lot since, is these women were also working full time, right? They didn't have jobs at the museum, but they already had a full slate of responsibilities. And so when they make the decision to go ahead and make their own cloth, it is a real, true, deep commitment to go through all of those steps and not just buy it from the British store down the road. And when we're thinking about cloth, it's also important to remember how much cloth was needed for this war. Women were not just making their own clothes and their own sheets and their own tablecloths. They're making cloth to support the soldiers and to support the war. Cloth goes for making soldiers' uniforms. It also goes for making their rucksacks. It goes for making the tents they sleep in. It goes for making the hammocks they sleep on. It goes for making the bandages that keep them alive. And so women dedicating themselves to this work is a real commitment and vital to the success of the war. And I've got, if you can read it on the screen, a quotation from an editorial from the period. The East Essex Gazette wrote, quote, "I presume there was never a time when, or a place where, the spinning wheel could more influence the affairs of men than at present in this and in the neighboring colonies." They really understood this labor as being essential to the winning and the victory in the war. Women who were part of non-importation movements, that is the boycotts of British products, were clearly very dedicated, and they were very proud of their efforts. And you see some evidence here. On the left side of the slide is a teapot that just says "No Stamp Act." That was just kind of a manifesto. They had that teapot, they're not going to support the Stamp Act. On the right side of the screen is a famous political cartoon from 1775 that's called the Edenton Ladies' Tea Party. It commemorates an event from 1774 when 51 women in the town of Edenton, North Carolina, came together publicly to sign a pledge that, quote, they were determined to give memorable proof of their patriotism. In this pledge, they said that they could not be, quote, indifferent on any occasion that appears nearly to affect the peace and happiness of our country. It is a duty that we owe, not only to our near and dear connections, but to ourselves. Right? It's a duty to themselves to boycott the British goods to make sure that this effort is successful. The cartoon was published a year later in Britain by a pro-British cartoonist who's clearly mocking the idea of the boycotts and mocking the idea of women's empowerment. You can see some details. You know, in the front, there are children sort of being neglected. You see towards the right side a woman who has kind of grotesque features. She seems to be the one leading the whole thing. Right in the middle of the picture is a woman who has a guy trying to stick his tongue in her ear. Clearly what the cartoonist is trying to do is mock these women for their presumption that they were going to have this political voice, they were going to make important political change. And he mocks them by saying, well, they're bad mothers, they're unwomanly, they look mannish, they've got bad morals. Interestingly, his most pointed critique, I would say, is the inclusion of another figure in the image. You might be able to see, like right here, there is one figure who is an enslaved woman, and she is the only person in the entire scene who's actually looking out at us. And I think the cartoonist is using her to sort of point out the hypocrisy of these Americans who say that they're taking the stand for independence when in fact they're also at the same time, in this case in Edenton, supporting slavery. In the center, you have an image of what's known as a handbill. And this was basically like the 18th century's version of what we would now call social media, right? If you wanted to get a message out fast and reach a lot of people and have it go viral, you would print these up, these statements, simple statements on relatively cheap paper, and then you'd hand them out in town, or you'd paste them up on posts in public places to spread your message. And this is a message encouraging people in Boston to boycott a particular store that sold British goods. And so it reads, William Jackson, an importer at the Brazen Head, north side of the townhouse and opposite the town pump in Cornhall, Boston. It is desired that the sons and daughters of liberty would not buy any one thing of him, for in so doing they will bring disgrace upon themselves and their posterity forever and ever. Amen. So they're pretty strong with the language there, forever and ever. Amen. But the part of this handbill that I want to call our attention to is the inclusion of the Daughters of Liberty. Right? They say it's the work of the Sons and the Daughters of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty are pretty well known in American history, but the Daughters of Liberty really were central in trying to make sure that these boycotts were successful. Sam Adams was the figure most widely associated with the Sons of Liberty, and often he gets credit for having formed the group. But he recognized how important women were to sustaining the boycotts, and he applauded the so-called Daughters of Liberty. He says that in fact, they played the leading role in making sure the boycotts of British goods were successful. And he said, quote, "With ladies on our side, we can make every Tory tremble." I think it's really important that when we study the American Revolution and we talk about the boycotts, we see that the boycotts were essentially the work of women. This is for a couple reasons. One, because women were the household provisioners. And so when a patriot family decided not to use British products, it was up to the women in the household to find the substitutions, whether it's collecting the berries for the tea, or collecting the honey from the hive, or doing all of that labor to make all of that cloth. But there's another reason why we should attribute the boycotts to women, and that's because apparently the men weren't very good at it. They apparently did not have the same kind of backbone that the women did. Patriot women would get aggravated with men who would backslide and shop at the British Allied stores. You see this aggravation very clearly in a poem that circulated widely during the Revolution. The author was a self-proclaimed daughter of liberty, and I've just reproduced a few lines. This is a fairly long poem. I've reproduced a few lines here that I think are kind of fun. She wrote, "Since the men from a party or fear of a frown are kept by a sugar plum quietly down, supinely asleep and deprived of their sight, are stripped of their freedom and robbed of their right. If the sons so degenerate the blessings despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise. And though we've no voice but a negative here, the use of the taxables let us forbear. Stand firmly resolved in bid Grenville to see that rather than freedom, we part with our tea." Grenville was a British official. He was like the Secretary of the Treasury kind of figure. He would have been the tax collector. The first part of this excerpt from this poem refers to how weak American men are. They're supine, they're asleep, they're giving up their liberty, they're kept down by a sugar plum, unlike the women who are gonna pick up the slack and make sure the job gets done. Thank goodness we have the Daughters of Liberty who will maintain the boycott. And she writes, "Though we have no voice but a negative here." Women don't have voice in politics, right? There's not that much we can do, but the one thing we can do is we can say no. We have that negative, right? We can say no to the British goods. Rather than giving up freedom, we'll give up our tea, unlike the men who apparently would do anything for a sugar plum. The boycotts are incredibly successful. They started in 1768 after the Townshend Acts, and in the first year of the boycotts, the value of British goods, imported British goods, fell by over half, from 420,000 pounds to 208,000 pounds, and the value keeps falling and falling and falling. Women's ability to sustain these boycotts is an underappreciated factor in the US triumph over Britain. After all, let's think about what Britain was fighting for. Why did Britain want to maintain colonies in North America? They wanted colonies because they wanted captive markets for their stuff. It was a mercantile relationship. So successful boycotts and American women's absolute determination not to purchase British goods was a complete disruptor of the colonial relationship. And I would argue it turned the tide of the war. Usually, we're taught the story of how Washington and Lafayette's great victory at Yorktown brought the British to their knees and ended the Revolutionary War. And it's true that Yorktown was a significant battle. But after Yorktown, Britain was still standing. They still had the superior army. They still had a superior navy. They still had more weapons, more soldiers, more treasure. What Britain was starting to lack was political will. The war ended after Yorktown because Parliament back in London decided to discontinue the effort. They thought it was no longer worth it. They came to that decision not because of anything happening on the battlefield, but because of what was happening in the marketplace. They wanted colonies they could control economically, but the women of America would not buy British goods. The boycotts had started in the 1760s. It was now 1781, and the calculation British leaders started to make was, yeah, we could beat these Yankees on the battlefield, but what will we have won at that point? We will have won the right to rule over people who still won't buy our stuff. And continuing to fight for such a meager outcome no longer seemed worth it, so they voted to discontinue the war. I think a very real argument can be made that it was really American women alongside the soldiers who won the war. Okay, so now we've established that patriot women were invested in the war. We've established that they made essential contributions to winning the war. Now we'll get to the analytical part, and we'll start to ask whether the American victory, the creation of the new United States, the drafting of the US Constitution actually brought positive change to women's lives. I opened this talk by asking us to look at the words of Abigail Adams that she wrote to her husband, John Adams. As we move towards the conclusion, I'd like to look at his reply. John Adams replies to Abigail, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Ha 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 ha. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters." So here he's making very interesting reference to all the ways in which liberation movements and social leveling movements were getting stirred up by this revolutionary fervor. He continues, "But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and more powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy, I won't blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems." So this doesn't sound too encouraging for Abigail. And when we look at the new code of laws that emerges from the revolution, which is to say the Constitution, there isn't any obvious explicit language that includes women or offers any new protections. There is an interesting development in the state of New Jersey, though, where for a brief moment after the Revolutionary War, women were in fact able to exercise the right to vote. In 1790, New Jersey passed a law, and you see a draft of it here, passed a law related to voting process. And buried in the detail of the law, it's like on page 7, and it's way down in Article 17. Buried in the law is a provision that stated, quote, "No person shall be entitled to vote in any other township or precinct than that in which he or she doth actually reside at the time of the election." And it's kind of a menial piece of technicality about voting law, but that really important phrase, he or she, indicates clearly that they expected women to be among the voters. Women did vote in New Jersey. Between 1790 and 1807, women cast between 7 and 15% of all ballots in the state. The historian Jan Lewis writes, quote, "Make no mistake, what New Jersey did was radical. It carried revolutionary doctrine to its furthest, but logical, extreme." This law was changed in 1807, however, and New Jersey women lost the right to vote. There were two main drivers behind that change, behind that loss. First, it was put forward by male politicians who were the ones who claimed that not enough women were voting for them. They claimed that they were not getting the petticoat vote, and so they sought to disenfranchise all women as a result. The second reason is that black citizens were voting as well in New Jersey, and this new law aimed to disenfranchise black voters. Authors of the new law, and here we see part of it. Authors of the new law did not own up to their prejudices, but instead they said that they wanted to prevent black men and all women from voting as a way to prevent voter fraud. Or as historian Marion Roadhouse explains it, quote, "The 1807 bill was couched as a means of eliminating blatant fraud at the polls rather than a specific attack on women voters or free black voters." So this is the language of the law. On this slide I've got the preamble, which is an attempt to kind of explain why the law is even necessary. And the law said, whereas doubts have been raised and great diversities in practice obtained throughout the state in regard to the admission of aliens, females, and persons of color, or Negroes, to vote in elections, as also in regard to the mode of ascertaining the qualifications of voters in respect to a state, and whereas it is highly necessary to the safety, quiet, good order, and dignity of the state. And then they go on to say that because of these reasons, because of presumed fraud, be it enacted by the Council and General Assembly of the state, that from and after the passing of this act, no person shall vote in any state or county election for officers in the government of the U.S. or in the state, unless such person be a free, white, male citizen of the state. I think it's worth pointing out that in this country, when authorities seek to curtail suffrage, they generally don't want to say that they're taking democratic rights away from people, but instead they couch it, they make the case in terms of imagined voter fraud. So when we try to assess the degree to which the American Revolution represented real change and new rights for American women, the New Jersey law is something of a vexing example. On the one hand, we see voting rights for women being enshrined into law in the 1700s, and we have ample evidence of women exercising those rights.
May I have your attention? It is now 7:45 p.m. and the Milton Library is closing in 15 minutes to 8 p.m. Those who read reports are now closed. Our teachers who read reports are now closed. Please bring the center placard to the front desk. If you need assistance, please stop at the front desk. The Milton Library will be closing promptly at 8 p.m. Thank you.
I'm almost done, I promise. The New Jersey law was a clear step forward. But then we also see the rug being pulled out from under women and black people in 1807, and it would be generations before those rights would return. So then that's a giant step backwards. After all of the work that women did to advance the aims of the revolution and to secure its victory, we don't see any obvious public ways in which women were enjoying new political rights and identities. They couldn't vote or run for office. They couldn't publish political writings unless they used a pseudonym. They couldn't own property if they were married. For formerly enslaved women in the northern states, people like Elizabeth Freeman, the revolution certainly did bring critical change. But for other women, in the legal sense, except for a few years there in New Jersey, there was no real change in their status or their rights or their public standing. I think we should wonder, though, about their private standing. And it does seem that for some women, the revolution may have brought a measure of liberation within the home. Historian Kathy Davidson notes that women's literacy went sky high in the U.S. after the revolution, as Americans understood that women, mothers, needed to be able to read in order to raise a generation of educated citizens. And I like to imagine the post-war lives of some of the women we've talked about tonight. Deborah Sampson, knowing that her military pension will support her husband after she has died. Or Lucy Knox, fighting to be the co-commander with the Secretary of War in their own home. And by all accounts, they did have a fairly egalitarian marriage after the war. I think about what must have gone on in the Adams household when John and Abigail were reunited, and she gave him a piece of her mind for that letter he wrote. I'll end with a quotation from John and Abigail's grandson, Charles, who noted in 1840 that while much ink has been spilled on the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, emerged victorious at Yorktown, and debated the framework of the Constitution, the experiences, influence, and contributions of women during this momentous period have been little noticed by history. Charles believed that the experiences, influences, and contributions of women mattered, and should be remembered. And I think that's a lesson that was probably passed down to him from his grandparents. It's also a lesson that teaches us that we should notice women, and that when we do, we learn that they have done extraordinary things. So, I'll leave it there.
Dr. Cain, thank you. We do have a couple moments for questions. We do have a couple announcements and a small presentation.